Hello everyone, welcome to another event of the Recess project. Today we will be discussing Säde Hormio's new book, Taking Responsibility for Climate Change. I am Emrah Aydinonat and I'm the leader of the Recess project and the researcher at Helsinki University. Our speakers today are Säde Hormio, David Schlosberg, and Matti Liski. Säde is an academy research fellow in practical philosophy at the University of Helsinki. David is the director of the Sydney Environment Institute and the professor of environmental politics at the University of Sydney. And he is also a visiting professor at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. Matti is a professor of economics at Aalto University School of Business. And we will start first with Säde's talk, and then David and Matti will comment on the book and Säde's presentation for 15 minutes each. After that, Säde will reply and answer their questions, and we will have some discussion between the speakers. After that, we will have a question and answer session. So, with great pleasure, I'm inviting Säde to the stage.
So thank you for being here, and thank you, Emrah, for the introduction. So the book that I'll be talking about is Taking Responsibility for Climate Change, and it's a very ambitious book in the sense that responsibility and climate change are very complicated and a big issue. It's only yesterday when I was finalizing the slides I realized I'm trying to say quite a lot in a little book, but then again I've already done it, so I thought it's okay. But now what I'm trying to do today is to just give you an overview of the kind of things that I'm talking about in the book without going to all the details because there just obviously wouldn't be time for it. But that's the starting position. It is that climate change is a very complex problem for responsibility. It's complex, the science is complex, and just like the scale, it's a global issue. It touches all of us. It's intergenerational. It's been caused by people who have long been dead, and it's going to affect people who are not yet born. And then it's just the causes and effects are very, very complex. So it's something we're all implicated in, and then the thought is who should take responsibility for fixing this issue? Because what is clear, that is anthropogenic, so it's man-made. So what I'm saying in the book is that we should be having this very, very much this all hands on deck approach to climate change. That it's not enough to just think that, yes, states should be doing something, or the United Nations should be doing something, or European Union should be doing something. There's a responsibility of all collective agents. So that includes the states and governments. They're very important in climate change action, and also the international actors, but they're not the whole story. That's my point in the book. So we also need to talk about the responsibility of companies and corporations and universities, associations, local governments, and so on. So any kind of collective agents that are out and about, they're also part of the problem at the moment. They're causing emissions, but they also can be part of the solution. So what kind of things do I have in mind then? Well, these examples here are all from the business side of things, but in the book I give also different kinds of examples of different kinds of collective agents, or for example, where they put their investments and things like that. But here are some examples from corporations. So what they should be doing depends on what kind of field they're in. So what kind of emissions and what kind of actions are causing these emissions in the first place? So here is a picture of a cement factory. That's a very, very, very carbon intensive line of heavy industry. And heavy industry in general, that's like very important. If that could decarbonize, that would have huge, massive impacts. Or if you're, say, like you're a food producer, you're making potato crisps, so then you're like doing some sort of cosmetics and you're using palm oil. Then also like the whole like palm oil, like what kind of palm oil are you having? Is this, for example, rainforest being culled to have the palm oil plantation? Or could you like introduce different kinds of products? So for example, here we have from a Finnish meat company that they started making these vegetarian burgers instead. From a lot of companies, it will be things like transportation, so like maritime shipping is one big source of carbon emissions. But it's also like all retailers, what kind of products they stock, how far they're being like manufactured. So there's just a huge amount of action that can be done, and it depends on the actual collective agent that's in question. Or if we're looking then at the local government level, you know, that could also be very important thing is, for example, the kind of infrastructure we have. Because like individuals can only make these green, pro-climate choices if there's options available. I mean, if you don't have good enough public transportation network, then you're going to have to take your own car to get to work, for example. But saying that all collective agents need to do something, I am not saying that they all are kind of created equal when it comes to climate change responsibility. We should really remember that fossil fuel companies bear much larger chunk of this responsibility because of the line of work they're in, the kind of potential they have to impact the change, and also what they've done so far. And it's just, it's quite staggering how few amount of companies we're really talking about at the end of the day. So here's like top 20, but it could be like top 63 is, we're already then covering most of emissions to this date after industrial time. So it's very, you know, the fossil fuels, burning too much fossil fuels, that's what's causing climate change. So we should not forget that this is like a very important part of climate change responsibility. And I go into this in more detail in the book. So what about individuals then? So usually when we're talking about individuals, in climate ethics, we're talking about them either as citizens and voters. So the idea is that maybe you should vote for like a greener government, politicians who will come up with climate laws and things like that. Or as consumers, that maybe you should be doing some sort of green consumer choices. But I think even though this is, and then of course the obvious problem is like, well, do my actions as a voter or do my actions as a consumer actually matter in the large scale? And then there's a lot of literature on this that maybe there's no effect of what we're doing as individuals. So I'm saying in the book that this is not the most kind of fruitful starting position when we're looking at individual responsibility. And this is because most emissions are tied to infrastructure. So say that you have enough the money to invest, for example, solar panels on the roof of your house. Then I mean that's obviously a big pro climate action thing that you're doing if you have the money to do such thing. But I mean, you don't have this kind of direct control of what kind of energy infrastructure is happening in the city where you're living in. How is the libraries and schools, you know, getting heated in the place where you're living, or like what the companies are doing. Are they putting solar panels up on their roof or not? But when we're looking at our kind of responsibility as members of all these different collective agents, which I was just saying that we need to get all collective agents, kind of all hands on deck approach at this point, then we can discuss the shared responsibility as members of these collective agents. And I think this is a more fruitful way of looking at individual responsibility. And yeah, sure, not all of us will be having these like very powerful positions within collective agents, but in most cases, there's still things we can do. I'll give some examples. I give much more in the book, but I'll give some examples soon. But the idea is here that when we're looking at individual responsibility, we should think about the different roles that give these different powers and positions to act from. So it's not just that like individuals can affect what's happening in corporations. It is really they have a completely different kinds of powers when they're part of, for example, a corporation or some other collective agent. You're not just acting as an individual, you're acting as an individual in a role then. So I think should be like more of the focus in climate ethics. And the kind of things they could doing. So, for example, you could like think like maybe your maybe the company. I'm giving again these company examples just because of space and time concerns here. That could that be something that like say like a big retail chain, if they invest in solar panels on all their roofs, those kinds of things have much bigger impact. Maybe you could be part of the change within that collective agent. Or also it could be things like employee activism. So there's been, for example, news like, for example, Google workers who've been calling on, or Amazon workers on getting their act together, these bigger companies. So it's like employee activism within the corporate agents themselves. But this is, of course, this can also be quite costly for the individuals, and this is not something that can be asked of everyone. So I go into, again in the book, I go into all the complications on this, but this is just a general point that let's look at what we can do in the different kind of collectives we are part of. And this can be also like kind of local level, like, I don't know, village council or the local politics or something, or just in your hobby group, or like, it can be many different kinds of things. But rather than thinking of yourself as this kind of isolated consumer or isolated voter, we are actually have a lot of these overlapping collectives that we are members of. And then I have this other suggestion in the book that we also should look at our responsibility as constituents of these unorganized collectives. So these are collectives, but they are not collectives in the sense that a university or an association or a government or a corporation is. So we are not like, we don't have that kind of internal rules and internal like hierarchy and things like that, which kind of makes it easier to assess our own roles in them. Rather, these are more kind of around social norms and the kind of social positions we occupy in society. And what I talk about in the book is this shared social orientation that we should become aware of. And then when we kind of start seeing these connections, we can make some changes. So I'll give two examples of that. The first one is on the super loose end of these unorganized collectives. So this is more like just a kind of loose social norms, for example, around what kind of food we're eating. So say that you want to, one of the easiest things to reduce emissions at the moment is to eat more plant-based food. So if there would be less like meat eating, and I don't mean like going fully vegetarian or anything, but like just eating plant-based meat or plant-based alternatives more often, then that would have a huge, that's kind of like an easy low-hanging fruit on climate action at the moment. But if you're doing it alone, that's not going to necessarily have an impact, for example, on the meat industry, because it's not like you're eating the whole cow on yourself. That's again like social norm. There's certain amount of animals being raised for certain kinds of consumer demand, and one person doesn't necessarily affect that. But then there's a missing slide here, sorry. So there was like a food that you can do and offer to your, I don't know what's happening here, sorry. But anyway, so but we also, we're offering food at gatherings or at work events and these kinds of things. So there we can maybe affect the kind of social norms that are taking place. And here is my other example. So this is, so this is now, this campaign called Clean Creatives. And what they're doing is that they are just individual advertisers, PR professionals and others who are coming together through this campaign and try to convince other like PR professionals or people working in advertisement to not work with the fossil fuel company greenwashing anymore. So this movement started in the States, where there's lots of people started feeling very queasy about their employers, engagement with fossil fuel companies. And then they started this campaign, and the idea is that to try to get action from inside the corporation itself, try to encourage them or like publicly a little bit shame them as well of doing better. And And so the idea is that this is not just people within one particular collective agent. Rather, they are people who have this shared social orientation of being professionals who are working in advertisement or PR, and whose companies are maybe contributing to greenwash around climate change. And then kind of when you become aware of that position, and then you kind of aware of those linkages, and then maybe can like create new networks of trying to change things. That's the idea in chapter 4. And then in chapter 5, I go into this idea of responsibility, which is not really discussed much, which comes from the fact that we have this huge emissions inequality in the world, and not just between countries, but also within countries. And I introduce what I call super polluters here, and the idea these are very individuals with these very mega polluting consumption choices. Here is a chart from Oxfam where they're showing that a lot of so this is like individual consumption. So this is not like kind of infrastructure state consumption. This is individual consumption, and you can see how much the richest 10% in the world are actually like doing, how much of the emissions are down to their consumption rather than the poorest 50%, which is just down here. So this is like an example of the kind of global emissions inequality, which is actually quite well known these days, that there is this huge discrepancy, and of course Finland will be up there. But what is less talked about is there's also huge discrepancies within countries. And there can be these people who are the super polluters who can be anywhere in the world. And here's an example of the kind of super polluter lifestyle, which includes yachts or private planes or very fancy cars or several homes. And this is actually not insignificant. This has been the driver, the carbon, the kind of emissions inequality between countries has been going down. What's been happening is the inequality within countries has been going up. And this is actually the top emitters are like really driving up the emissions at the moment. It's actually like if your average person in Europe, their emissions are actually the impact of the European Union policies is showing already there, but it's not showing at this top level of polluting at all. And I'm talking now about only like 0.3%, the very top of emitters. So these are people who are called in the finance lingo high net worth individuals. So they have over $1 million in investable wealth, which means that money that they have on top of their like primary residence and their like personal belongings and stuff. And this is a group that has been growing exponentially in the past 20 years, and their also emissions have been growing exponentially. And maybe there's certain kind of things that are very cool, like going to space at the moment, but that's maybe not the best thing we should be doing at the moment when we really need to get our emissions down. So that maybe there's also certain kind of like choice editing that's needed at the policy level. And then the final chapter, which I don't go into much detail because Matti Liski will be commenting on that chapter. I talk about climate policy making then. So I've like gone through these different aspects of climate responsibility. And here I argue that in general, value choices are inevitable because they're embedded in these policy choices and economic analysis. So we just cannot escape them. So these should be debated openly to get climate policy right. And I'm saying that, well, what is then the point of doing things like writing a book about climate change responsibility? I'm saying that ethics can highlight what is at stake and ground normative arguments in deliberations. And as I said, I won't be going into a lot of the economic side, but because of the theme of the seminar series, I will give you just one example before I finish. And this is on the kind of influence that economics has had on climate policy so far. So let's go a little bit back in history. There was a time when the climate science was just emerging, and then this was not a bipartisan issue at all in the States. Like Republicans were as worried about this as Democrats. And then they were like, let's do something, that we should take some action now. So this was in the 1980s. I mean, it was discussed already in the US Senate in 1969 or something, but like this was in the 80s, people were already worried about this. And there was this policy paper, which is called Changing Climate Report on the Carbon Dioxide Assessment Committee. And this was done by the National Research Council. So this is from 1983. And this report gave politicians the feeling that instead of that we don't actually need this very urgent action and tough decisions, we needed to do more research to find more about climate change. And why did it come there? There was chapters by natural scientists, and they concluded that human activities had increased carbon dioxide concentration, which will affect ecosystems, the weather, and agriculture. So this is before the IPCC report started coming out. So this is 1983, this is not 1990. This is before it became like very big, like widely known. But it was already then, the scientists were in an agreement that this is a big thing. And mitigation was offered as the solution. But the economists who wrote 2 out of the 5 chapters, they were saying that they had that nothing more than wait and see approach is needed to be taken, and that's because they were discounting the future benefits and the future harms, and then when you had the synthesis report where 3 out of the 5 chapters were saying urgent action, the synthesis report was going for the let's just wait and see the economics message. And then it's largely ignored the natural scientists, and then the politicians decided to just fund more research, and nothing was done, and this was like a big opportunity miss. So this is just a kind of negative example of how climate economics, and I'm not saying like the climate economists themselves, but just like how maybe economic arguments can sometimes get twisted in political things and how they are used. So, but I'm not going to go more into this because, as I said, Professor Liski will be talking about that chapter. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And next is David. Thanks.
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I really feel quite privileged helping to launch this book. So I'm going to talk about a few parts of the book, then ask a few questions, and then give a couple of appreciations, and I'll come to that. So I really think this is quite an important book about collective responsibility for climate change, widely conceived, but also about the role of individual responsibility within collective structures. And I really think this is one of the innovative parts of the book, this focus on the intersection of individual and collective responsibility, which is both a central issue and I think really under-theorized. So the work makes an important, a pragmatic, and I'd say really an energizing and motivating point about the reality of the role of individuals within collective entities and a variety of collective structures. And I think that overview showed that the book is comprehensive without being oppressingly so, or oppressively so. A lot of climate ethics books are, sorry to a lot of my friends, but it's very clearly written, broad-ranging, engaging, full of a lot of actual examples, not just hypotheticals, which you philosophers really like to use. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I took a ton of notes. I've got pages and pages of notes, so just a genuine thanks for that, and I just want to start with a hearty congratulations to Säde for that. So yeah, I want to make a couple of comments about what I see as some crucial contributions, a few not so much critiques, just queries, questions that we can start with, and then, like I said, some appreciations. So the premise of the book, again, very clearly stated, is that social, collective, corporate, other structures are not inevitable. They are built by people. This is where we live, in these intersections of the individual and collective. We're not simply passive subjects. We are part of those collectives. And there are 2 really crucial points about that intersection. And so this is a quote, that collectives of various stripes bear responsibility for climate change, be they states, international bodies, corporations, or other collective entities. And there's a recognition of specifically, and we heard this earlier, about the responsibility of specific corporations and industries and their relationships with governments. I'm saying this as a political scientist, so this is really important to me, and it was good to see this, and quoting Henry Shue about the politico-economic web, and many others have written about that sort of route of climate action. But the work here is about that within those collectives, most of our individual choices are still tied to those broader structures. Those broader structures do limit our individual responsibility to some extent, but they don't limit it or block it completely. And again, I think that's a really crucial contribution. So there's a nod to folks like Iris Young, who caution that structural injustices not just undermine our individual choice, but also limit the means for us to develop the capacities to develop those choices as well. And I think that's a big part, not just of that sort of philosophical critique, but of a lot of climate injustice lit as well. So there's a lot of substantive reflection and caution here, which I really appreciated. And this is absolutely not an individualist account of climate responsibility. But at the same time, there is this description of the crucial role that individuals do and can play in collective responsibility, given the role that individuals play in the construction of collectives and their norms, and I really like that part of the book as well. There's still room to focus on individual responsibility within the reality that collectives create and the harm that they do. So there's just an important recognition of both the reality and the power of broader structures on the one hand, and the role that individuals can still play within them. And I think that recognition and that balance is a really crucial part of the argument. I think crucially, this is not just an academic argument, right? We're seeing a lot of examples of this kind of responsibility taking at the intersection of individual and collective, and not just on climate change. So on the one hand, I think this illustrates the importance of targeting corporate leaders for their responsibility for climate change. There's a huge shift to this in the youth climate movement, interrupting and disrupting events with the heads of these various companies. There are lots of protests that are really trying to pin down the folks that are at the helm of a number of these corporations. But I also think this rationale, individual responsibility for collectives of which we are a part, is behind a number of other current actions as well, right? So I just walked through a Palestinian protest, and obviously in the US and in Australia right now, there are ongoing student protests and encampments focused on the broader issue of the war and Palestinian sovereignty and rights, but also on their own universities' collective responsibility for that via investments in munitions manufacturers, research partnerships that assist the devastation that's brought against civilians. So the demands aren't just about the war, they're about the university's role in the war as well. And so students are taking this kind of individual responsibility for the actions and complicity of the institutions of which they are a part. And that's the kind of action that's at the intersection that Säde lays out. I hope you agree with me on that, or else I'm in trouble. So I think the book really fills this crucial gap between a number of broadly discussed areas of responsibility. I also really appreciate that the work is consciously supplemental to the kind of work that folks in my own field are doing. There's a shout out to Liz Cripp's work on the responsibility for political action. There's long-standing work here in politics about individual responsibility to get governments to change behavior. There's a lot in environmental citizenship, climate citizenship that started in the early 2000s. It continues. I think it's really a key difference between political theorists and philosophers on this issue of responsibility. But generally, I think Säde is opening another door to action and responsibility, and being someone who's in an organization that contributes to climate change, right, a major university, and someone tied to a number of these informal collectives from, food interest to public transport user. I really appreciate this expansion of our understanding of different types of responsibility for climate change. And also, as a political theorist interested in social movement strategy, I really appreciate the sort of grounded, the realistic, the pragmatic approach to the discussion of collective responsibility. But I'll come back to that. Okay, so now a few questions. And maybe the first is obvious coming from someone who works on politics. There are, as you said, very few collectives who are responsible for the bulk of climate emissions, right? A number of companies in the fossil fuel industry who captured governments and even international processes. So how do these crucial suggestions for taking responsibility that you lay out enable us to take on the reality of a fossil fuel industry that now not only attends COPs, but actually runs them? right? So I know you're clearly aware of that question. I mentioned this sort of shout out to Shu and to Liz Cripps, and you make clear, quote, when the threat or the harm is tied to structures, it's not enough that at the moment of danger we cooperate to prevent harm. Instead, we need to fix the structures that create and facilitate the harm in the first place. If we approach polluters responsible for fossil fuel emissions as just an aggregate of individuals, we're failing to look into the structural issues that underpin climate harms. So I'm not really asking about whether or not you're addressing those structural causes. You do that, but I wonder, as part of the question, I wonder what is the calculus of responsibility or action here? How should individuals respond to that reality of the vast amount of responsibility being in the structural corruption of a fossil-fueled political economy? And then more generally, how are individuals to address or rank, figure out, the broad range of their own responsibilities in the broad range of collectives that we're tied to, right? Should we focus on issues or collectives where there may be some potential for success, even if that has little impact on these larger structures? Or do we all have responsibility to take on those broader structures where we are collectively immersed? How do we decide which of the many collective and individual responsibilities do we address? So, it's a very self-interested question, right? My own role at the University of Sydney is an example of both the strengths and weaknesses of being an active agent in a collective that's guilty to a certain extent. So my colleagues and I at the Sydney Environment Institute, we were a key part of the development of the university's current sustainability strategy. We helped to initiate it. We ran public engagement across campus. We helped the research behind the goals and the drafting. Now we assist with implementation and reporting. And that's been great, right? It's led to a shift in the university's operations. University of Sydney is now all renewable energy. We've got new food policies. We've got new composting. And all this stuff is going on. New investment policies, which are great. That was a battle. New travel policies, a battle not so successful. But we've been able to link the administration and operations with relevant academic knowledge from around campus. There really has been that sort of sense of individual responsibility to help the collective do better. That all said, the broader impact of all that work on Australian emissions is nearly nothing, right? What exactly are we accomplishing? We've done nothing to impact or counter the power of the coal and gas industry, even with divestment. And we've done nothing to counter the corruption of the major political parties and governments at every level. Gas exploration and export are way up, higher than they were before, even after our own actions in this collective workplace. So we can take responsibility for this collective that we're in, and we've done that. But how and can we demand or should we demand the university do something more broad, more structural? Should we demand the university step in more politically and make a statement about the dominance and interference of the mining industry in Australian politics? So what are the limits of our responsibility as members of collectives that have done some good, but not enough? Second question, I'll do this one quickly. I'm really curious about climate responsibility beyond emissions. So the book focuses mainly on emissions reduction. What's the responsibility to act with respect, on the other hand, to the impacts of climate change, right? Especially the inequitable impacts of climate change, right? You say if a collective causes harm, there's a collective responsibility to fix it. But how far does that go? Right? Does a city or a company or a university with historical emissions have a responsibility, this is a key question we're battling with now, to assist nearby communities who are subject to floods and storms and heat waves? Right? So this is, I work in a university that has lots of air-conditioned buildings that allows us to work when it's 37 freaking degrees in Sydney. Right? But we have very disadvantaged communities around us with terrible housing, no air conditioning, or no money to run that air conditioning, even if they have it. Does the university have a collective responsibility to those who are now made vulnerable by climate change? Do employees of the university, do students of the university have a responsibility to demand that the university do something about their historical emissions and their impacts? Okay, last question. a question about what taking responsibility for climate change entails in terms of the range of actions. So much of the book is about changing minds and changing behavior, shifting norms in shared social orientation. I really like the work on unorganized collectives and influencing them and the social norms within them. But here's a provocation, right? I wonder if you agree with Andreas Malm about other possible tactics, right? Does our responsibility also include direct action and maybe even sabotage? I'm thinking, it's the yachts and the killer whales taking on the yacht. They're taking responsibility, right? But that's sabotage. So I think it'd be really interesting to put you in conversation because I think there's broad agreement on this question of responsibility, in particular individual responsibility within collectives. But how far do we go when it comes to taking action? How far in trying to influence collectives that we're part of or caught up in? Is it just about responsibility to say something, to protest, to lobby? Or is sabotage okay, right? In short, where are you on blowing up pipelines? There's this, people don't talk about this. There's a lot of academic talk about Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future. But there's a part of that book where he talks about environmentalists blowing up airplanes, right, to shut down the global airline industry. Nobody talks about this part of the book, right? It works. The airline industry is basically put out of business as part of the fiction of this book. But that's more than sabotage, right? That's murder. But nobody's critiqued Robinson, as far as I know, for the sort of advocating that kind of mass murder, but going a bit further than Malm. But this is the question, right? How far does responsibility go in terms of taking action? Okay, that's the questions, and I look forward to discussion, but I do want to offer just a couple of appreciations before finishing. And it does get to the last chapter, which I know I wasn't supposed to comment on, but it's so good I have to. So in 2010, Posner and Weisbeck published this book with the absolutely ridiculous argument that ethics has no role in climate policy, where the self-interest of states alone should guide policy design. This is why I'm talking about it. This is the only time in my career that I've taken the time to write an absolutely savage book review, right? They called the book Climate Change Justice. I said it should have been called Climate Change Policy Without Justice, because that's what it was. I also said something else about illustrating how climate change could melt ideas and imaginations as much as ice. It was harsh. So I'm really glad that you took on at least Weisbeck on that. And it's a really solid, and I should say much more constructive response than mine. And I really like the argument that you make about the idea of ethical free economic policy is a fiction. This critique of the discount rate is really well done. I'm sure we'll hear more about that. But just the way you take on that self-interested approach in Weisbeck's work is just really good. The conflation of individual and collective interest, the lack of differentiation between short-term and long-term interest, it's really a solid takedown. And I really appreciate that. So thanks. Right? It finishes with this great line that the complexity of self-interest seems to elude him. It's so kind and cutting at the same time. Last point on deliberative democracy. So it's often the case, and I'm guilty of this as well, that climate change books will close with a chapter or a shout out to deliberative democracy. But in that chapter, I think you really offer a thorough and impressive philosophical argument for the role of deliberative democracy, in particular around avoiding biases, engaging cognitive and value diversity, and encouraging the development of collective preferences, not just individual. It's a great way to close, and it's a great way to lay out some of the collective structures for both individual and collective intervention in policy. And I think it's really timely given the huge growth of demand for climate assemblies that we've seen in the last few years. So look, overall, it's a great and crucial addition to the literature. It's a great call for this all hands on deck approach, individual and collective, organizations and structures of all sizes. So again, just many thanks for the work, for the stimulation, and a hearty congratulations from me.
Matti?
Thank you, Säde. I feel honored to be here, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to read the paper in advance, and I will go back to it, I'm sure. I also have very long list of notes, and which I unfortunately cannot see very well, given I have the wrong glasses here today. But it's really, I enjoyed in particular seeing all the connections that you make to different literatures. And I remember once you organized a meeting here at the university where John Broome was visiting, and that was, after that I studied more his writings, and I ended up actually using in one of our principles of economics courses his text on that I will comment on later. But in that text, he kind of shows how the moral duties that we have connect to the concepts that economists are using. And in a similar way, I'm sure that I will find something to be in this book that I can use in the future in teaching as well. So I'm I have this role of representing the bad people, the economists that you are sort of criticizing in the last chapter, and it is a really good one. And but I must say that the whole theme of the book, sort of the problem of collective action, and is really something that economists are quite a bit working on, myself included. But I will try to stick to the last chapter and a little bit summarize first what's in there. So if my sort of quick summary of that, you basically make the point that these ethical questions in policy choices should be openly debated. They should be made clear what they are, and this can help us to better understand how we think about these problems that we haven't faced before. So this kind of this debate itself opens our minds and broadens the horizon that how we think about these problems. An important part of this sort of debate and process is the policy-making process itself, and the role of democracy in this. Because if I understood it correctly, you argue strongly for this, that democracy is really the right sort of political institution to sort of deal with this process of deliberation and also sort of finding out what our values are, and then also communicating with the policymakers. In contrast to this kind of, there is an interesting sort of link in the writing that you start arguing. You argue in favor of democracy over, for example, sort of benevolent dictatorship, and then we move into models as if the models were kind of representing what dictators would be doing. And in that's the way actually how in economics we often use the words, that if we think about how a benevolent dictator would plan the world, if the dictator could take the actions on our behalf, that dictator would perhaps use the models in a way that the problem is solved in the best possible way. But what you argue is that in these models, the ethical choices should be more openly communicated, and this kind of technocratic approach itself is not an option. The values that we are implicitly or explicitly making should be debated, and they they come outside the model. They are not something that the model can produce. So you argue in the chapter that we cannot use single formulas to solve this kind of complicated problem, and the discounting problem is a very good example of that. You cannot just compress all these costs and benefits into one number and then based on that make an action, as you had the example from 1983, where discounting was really dominating everything. And also we have to avoid narrow framings, something that these models can sometimes lead to, that you tend to think too narrowly of the problem and not taking into account all the sort of in particular, the value-related sort of value judgments are not perhaps not perhaps if you go the model first, you may not see the whole picture. Then you have this, what David was also pointing out about the self-interest and ethical reflection, and I want to come back to that a little bit, and to John Broome, because yeah, as a little bit of a spoiler, an article, the title of his article on this issue was that "Do not ask for morality," which is kind of I'd like to hear about that when we move on with the discussion. But let me first say that I fully agree. So I fail to be the bad person in the sense that I fully agree with your main point that that the value judgments should come first, and then the possible sort of numbers and sort of assessments that are of the quantitative nature, they can only come after this. And in particular, I really strongly agree with you what you say about this, how these models are often misused. And I hope to, in this discussion, give you some sort of reflection on how I think there are many good people among economists who use models, and they understand what their role is. And then also the democracy is something that is really, in my view as well, and often we economists, when we think about sort of conceptual work on how we should represent people's preferences, they kind of come back very close to the ideas that you are now here elaborating as well. So I on all fronts I agree very much, even on this selfish part, which is although I'm using this this particular article by John Broome, I still think that I'm kind of inclined to be with you on this issue. But let's talk about the models a little bit. Do you remember the movie by Monty Python, The Holy Grail? It has this one-liner. How does it go? The knights are coming to, they are arriving at their destination, and they see a beautiful castle and the view, and then everybody's like, "Wow, what a castle, beautiful!" And then the servant said, "It's only a model." It's as if, that don't you see it? This is a movie. We made the model for this movie, and it's not a real one. So I like this quotation when you want to sort of communicate to people what are the limits of models, because I think there are many people out there who should be reminded almost daily that it's only a model that you're using. And these are often people who are sort of practical men or women who work under time pressure to produce numbers. Think about the government. Government is currently making many decisions that are kind of using all kinds of models, and the values are not. There's not too much time to discuss about the values behind this model production part. And even that is what I try to teach to our students, that whenever you're summing over somebody's benefits and somebody else's costs, that's already a value statement. Although it's very easy to do that in Excel or anywhere, but you often forget that these are, some people are experiencing these costs and some other people are getting benefits, and that's this summation. Even though you get a nice number, there's a value judgment based on there. A value of €1 to a rich person is different than to a poor person, for example, and you should take that into account in your calculation. That is often not done, and the virtue of this approach is, of course, that you, if you want to describe sort of somehow how a system works in an efficient way, think about, for example, energy markets or something like that. It's very useful to know how this kind of system can be designed in a way that is efficient. And these models, without value judgment, they are good in that. It's not a surprise why, for example, consultants are often using these models. They can have engineering background or economics background, and they're not used to this thinking that you should think about values that are behind this. For example, precisely this, that if you're summing costs to some people and benefits to some other people, then you should put weights on, for example, what are the incomes of these people. Yes, like I said, this is often, you have to understand why these models are sort of, what is the sort of practical need for this, and And if I give you some examples, for example, where where I, as an economist, have sort of encountered this demand for numbers, and then I have been kind of almost refusing to produce these numbers. We, as at the university, sometimes we are invited to work with the policymakers. Like, for example, the city of Helsinki. We've been trying to help with some choices related to transport, emissions from transport, or even sort of budgeting. For example, there's a very expensive library here at the city center, and that was causing some troubles for the budget of the city, and we were asked to help them to solve some trade-offs. And they was like, basically there was just a need for numbers, and we, in the end, we said that we cannot produce the numbers before we hear from you that what are your values, basically. How much you value that if you put a higher ticket price to a swimming hall, for example, then what are the benefits that you might be losing by doing that? And all of that has to be valued first before you can make any kind of calculations. And in the end, I don't think we produce any sensible numbers because it all ended in this value discussion. But this is an example how if you want to do it carefully, this is the kind of process you have to go through before you start working with the numbers. But let me say that there are lots of economists who are using formal frameworks, if I call it a little bit more broadly than models, with no intention to produce numbers in the end. Because this formal framework is just our way of testing the validity of our arguments. It's kind of providing somewhat more axiomatic framework than just using words. And we can think about, for example, this: how can we bring different types of values into climate policy making, for example, regarding intergenerational justice? How should we think about discounting over a very long time horizon? We have actually a long history in economics thinking about very low discounting. Frank Ramsey, a philosopher, economist as well, he died very young. He was 27 when he died. So, and I think it was in the 1920s when he produced a paper about zero discounting. And and there's a long history in that. And then you're mentioning Matti Weitzman, who's been very active. And this climate discussion has sort of triggered this interest in this. And myself, I've been working on that as well. And you took that example from the 1983, I think it was, which is a very good example that how these practical men advising policymakers can get it wrong. But if we go even one decade earlier, like 1973, then William Nordhaus, who is one of these people who has been discounting a little bit too much, but on the other hand, he was the one who was very much the first economist considering this climate change problem. At the time of the oil price crisis in the 1970s, when everybody was concerned that we are running out of oil in the world, he was pointing out, no, the problem is not that we have too little in the ground, but we don't have enough space up there. So he was doing working with models, and it was, to me, it was really like an eye-opening thing to see quantitatively how critical this problem is, that you really don't have enough space there. And it's, we have to give some credit to him to being like a few decades before anyone else. He got the Nobel Prize. That's some credit. But the discounting part is really the part where the values are really showing up, and you have a very nice section in the book on that. And but I just want to sort of add to that there has been quite a bit of progress on this. I see that time is running. I have some questions about, for example, I really like, and I agree, I tend to agree with this, what you say about democracy. But in the end, I also ask, what is it in the end that makes democracy to work? Somehow, you had this Jubileumsfond here. You were giving thanks to the Jubileumsfond, and I was for a number of years serving the fund. and reading the applications. And when I was reading the political scientists' proposals, they were asking this very basic question: what is it in the end that why democracy is better than some other system? And somehow I got the feeling that from the proposals that it is because, very simply, that in democracy policymakers are accountable. It's not that in democracy we necessarily find the best talent to make decisions for us. They may not be very talented always. The dictators could be very bright people, but they're not accountable. And I somehow think that this argument could be developed further in this connection, because who are you accountable to? You're accountable to people with some values, and I think it's part of the sort of this definition of democracy, that your values can be expressed and they can be developed, and they can be developed in particular in this connection when we are facing a problem that we haven't seen before. And then policymakers should behave in the way that they are consistent with these values. So let me then give you this hard question. You basically argue, like, and David was also bringing this up, that if that the self-interest is not enough in climate change policy making, you also need to have values that make you to behave in a way that you overcome problems of collective action that relate to free riding and things like that, that we typically, that economists often sort of consider to be the main problems. And at the same time, when you are citing John Broome, and he has been writing that, well, if we just define our values and then we behave in a self-interest way, then that should be enough. I'm not sure how to precisely reconcile the two views. Maybe we can discuss on this, and you can help me to reconcile, because I would like to understand it better, to be able to explain it to the students and so forth. But this is the one main question that I have. Then also about you warn about this problem of narrow framing, that we should not think about for example, there was this misperception that this problem could be solved, for example, in the same way as the ozone depletion problem was solved. This is much more multifaceted problem that we have to all the time kind of keep all the things on the table when we try to address this problem. And if you look at the climate negotiations, how they in practice take place, it really looks like all the issues are on the table. And that makes those negotiations very difficult, because when you enter, some people might disagree who have been in the negotiations, but at least for outsiders, it looks like that it's a very practical way of trying to come up with the sort of climate contract that could really solve the problem. So, and therefore, many economists have been addressing that you should put many other things aside and decide before you enter the room what you negotiate about. And economists are typically saying that you should negotiate about the carbon tax, global carbon tax, for example, or something like that. What's your take on this? Is it practical to keep all the full diversity of issues on the table when you're trying to come up with the climate policy solution that works? Okay, maybe we can continue with the other topics as we enter the discussion phase. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I invite all of you to the stage and Säde to answer the questions? Yeah, I will. So, Säde, I guess
Yes.
you have questions to answer.
Okay, yes, I do. Thank you very much. Those were very great questions from both of you. So I really appreciate you taking the time to read through the work and have such insightful questions. I think I'm going to start off with Matti, just because they're like, let's go in the reverse order. So the first thing is like, so yes, there is criticism towards this overly technocratic way of making climate policy, right? Or like this, as you said, kind of over reliance on models and other things. But what I was a bit nervous. I have to now read through the chapter again. What did I actually write there? Because I wasn't trying to criticize economists as such, you know. And I actually I do think there's lots of climate economists who are doing really great job. And you know, like even like with Nordhaus, you know, I'm not criticizing him there. I'm just giving him as a kind of background. I think who I'm strongly criticizing, as David was saying with the whole self-interest thing, is this whole idea that there would be like this idea like that Weisbach has that you know, like we don't need this kind of value debate. We don't need any of this stuff because we already have these great models, and then we have self-interest, and let's just kind of, it's almost like we'll just input this thing and the machine comes out with the right answers, and like, you know, who needs all this like messy politics, and let's get rid of this like stupid, you know, like, well, he's saying basically that all of climate ethics is also like pointless as well, right? You know, like, you know, that if you just understand that it's in your self-interest, then you'll do the right thing, and right? So that's why, so that kind of thinking is my target. And that's usually done by people who are not economists. Like economists are like too like smart to know what economics can and cannot do, right? So they usually, it's more sophisticated, right? But it's exactly that pressure that you were saying of the practical men and women who need to make decisions, and they need to have numbers, and then it's difficult decisions, and sometimes maybe you have to make decisions very quickly, and there's no maybe time, especially to put everything on the table, as you said. And then there is this kind of, there is this real kind of easy solution of, oh, let's just take this kind of analysis and let's make the decisions based on that. Even though maybe the persons who have made that analysis are saying something more sophisticated and maybe awkward politically, you know, like on the one hand and on the other hand, and then you just kind of make it overly simplistic. So yeah, so my target for the criticism is this is in general just the people who are thinking that there's no need. There's no need for value talk, this kind of messy politics, any of this. Let's just, we know what we do, let's just go there. And the reason I am going back in the history, so as you said, you know, yeah, climate economics has moved, you know, much more sophisticated stuff, which is doing now. But why I'm going back to the 1983 and why I'm going back to the Nordhaus and Stern and the discounting debate and everything, it's just to kind of give background to how we got here. And I think those are some of the kind of steps that, and the whole framing of the ozone layer, that, hey, here's just another one, let's just do another Montreal Protocol and everything is sorted. And the kind of things that were missed in the process of the crucial differences between the two problems. You know, it is, I mean, ozone layer depletion, very complex problem as well, but nowhere near the thing of climate change. And also then we're missing like the fossil fuel companies, you know, which and the political power that they have. As I say, they're not only like pulling the strings of politicians, they're actually running now these meetings where we should be coming up with like climate action, right? So the kind of political power and everything was vastly underestimated at that time, and there was this almost this simplistic, naive, optimistic idea that, hey, we have the tools and now we just got to sort it out, and oh, why aren't you signing? That kind of thinking there, right? So my argument is just that if there wasn't that kind of overly optimistic view of technocracy, then maybe we wouldn't be in this mess, like, or at least as in bad mess, because we kind of wasted some decades of like, and that's not the only reason, like the fossil fuel lobbying that I also talk about there, and the kind of misinformation campaigns, you know, that's a lot of the thing. So, but that's a target I'm trying to address in chapter 6. So, so the idea is just that it would be great if there would be these easy solutions that you could like get, and then you could just implement them, and then an elite could do all the work. And but it doesn't work, especially if we're talking about things and social norms and there's infrastructure and these huge difficult choices we have to now make, like to do with like mitigation and adaptation and everything else. And that's just, you just cannot take the tough part and the tough decisions and the messy debates out of it. So that's overall what I'm trying to say in that chapter. I do think it would be impractical to try to keep all these issues on the table at the same time, right? So the idea is not that we would go on this full-on like debate, like, well, should we do something about climate change or something? And as a great example that you point out, like the global carbon tax. This almost all the economists seem to agree that this would be the most efficient way. But then the politicians are always like, well, there's not enough support for it, and then they're just too scared to implement it, right? I mean, there's little bit of stuff, in Canada, but not like in large enough scale. I mean, there are some taxes. There's taxes in Finland as well, but like on this really like big scale thing. But I think it's like these kind of things that if these things would be opened up a bit more in public debate and kind of not like just like everything is not up for grabs. The example I give there is the Ireland, where they had, where they managed to get with like participatory democracy debates, and of course they had like the citizen assembly, but they managed to turn around Ireland's not very ambitious at all climate policy around much faster than anybody thought into an actual quite ambitious climate policy. And it was the politicians were saying like, the sheep farmers and everybody, they're not going to like support this kind of stuff. But it actually, when it was coming from the citizens themselves, it was actually much more ambitious. Or the Ecuador example I'll give there, and that is like a poor country deciding like, no, we're going to keep the rainforest rather than like drill for more oil. Whereas the politicians are saying, we have no options, we're a poor country, we have to drill the oil there. And then the citizens are voting, actually no. That's not something that people are maybe predicting that will happen, right? So that's why I'm thinking that we shouldn't underestimate what people are actually willing to vote on, or what they're thinking, or like before. I think it's a very kind of like, in a sense, there's a lot of this kind of elitism also. They're just thinking like, well, people will vote wrongly, or they wouldn't support this action and things like that. So I think that's a great question about what's the benefit of democracy. Yeah, accountability with values and stuff. But it's such a huge question. And here I'm kind of talking more like kind of instrumental way in the book, but I'm saying that I am not ruling out that there's also all these other intrinsic values as well in democracy. But yeah, it's a huge topic. I don't know if I have anything too clever to say for that right now. So there is, so I do think there is this demand for numbers, and I think it's great that economists are providing it. And I think actually I have this new work that I'm trying to write at the moment, where I'm saying this kind of like how economists can also be like, they have this kind of almost powerful tools at their disposal, where they could like be showing, for example, the feasibility of actual quite ambitious climate action and things like that through the kind of political tools that they have, that politicians are used to listening and things. So I'm doing like this further development of that paper. Maybe I'll send it to you and you can give me your comments on that. But the idea is like, I'm really trying to target that overly technocratic thing. And I'm not against technocrats as such either. Like, like Obama years, great technocrats were there, as well, but that's just, it cannot be the whole solution, kind of. Does that answer your questions mostly, or?
Yes, absolutely. I was just taking this role of a bad person here, sort of. Your chapter is very well balanced on this. So maybe we can continue later, or do you want to? Yeah.
Sure. So I don't think you were being the bad guy at all. I think it was a very nicely balanced, but I think it's also very hard because I'm trying to criticize some parts of the thing, but I'm not criticizing everything. And then to David's comments, you were asking me some incredibly difficult questions as well, including should we be blowing up pipelines and things. So, what it entails in terms of other possible actions, can it include sabotage? How far should we go? Here I'm going to take maybe, I don't know if this is the coward's route or not, or if I'm just being a sensible philosopher, but here I'm going to say that I don't think it should be up to me, and I think here is my limits as what I am as a kind of philosopher should be saying about these things. I do think these are the kind of things where it goes more like towards the kind of, well, what is the wider situation? What are the response that people are getting? You know, like it's kind of with any kind of demonstration, because you mentioned lots of other like demonstration that's, you know, like the Western world is in turmoil at the moment in many aspects. So it always seems like, I think it's very hard to draw a line before, well, I would definitely draw a line of like blowing up planes. I wasn't actually aware of that, and killing people. I think that's just a rather insane suggestion. So yeah, I would never like harm other people for any of this kind of action. But in terms of like, should people go and glue themselves into paintings or disrupt like economy, or like, I don't have answers to that. I think it depends on the country, or what are the politicians doing, not doing, what have the people been trying to do beforehand to try to get them to act. Maybe we should do something a bit more when it comes to like fossil fuel companies and stuff. I think also it's what is needed is this kind of public uncomfortableness with some of the aspects. So let's say I used to live in Britain for many years, so I kind of, well, after Brexit, but I still kind of consider it as my second home country, even though they might not consider me anymore after Brexit, but as their resident. But anyway, what's happening there, which I think is really interesting, it's only starting to like recently surface this slight uncomfortableness about the super close ties to a lot of Gulf state oil companies, right? And the kind of power they then have in the British human rights and liberal policy and things like that. And then they seem to have this kind of, well, we don't really go there. You know, there's certain like line, like they're too important for us economically. Let's not go there. And this kind of, and I think there should be a lot of more debate about that, and there should be like this feeling of uncomfortableness more around issues like that. And every country has these things that we should feel very uncomfortable about. Like, you know, well, you know, the Ukraine war has brought these uncomfortable discussions, for example, in Germany about the natural gas coming from Russia and all these other things, which are also related to climate change, right? But in terms of how far we should go, I think that's something that depends on the situation, and we have to kind of negotiate as a society, if that makes sense. Yeah. But I do think there is responsibility to assist the disadvantaged communities as well. So you were giving the example of that you have a nice air conditioning, and then, you know, like you're there happily doing your academic work, and then others are boiling. So yeah, so I don't go into, I kind of stick to mitigation, because mitigation is like very, very clearly full-on collective problem, right? Because the benefits are for everybody, and the costs, you know, like whereas when you're doing like adaptation and other things, you can benefit much smaller amounts of people, right? So it can be more targeted, those kinds of compensation as well. So I don't go into those debates, and also because I try to keep it relatively simple. I mean, not simple, but like you have to pick your battles, and I think I've picked too many battles already as it is. But yeah, I do think like the kind of the general overall view, and for example, the shared social orientation, that's something that I think could be very beneficial if you're trying to conceptualize that, maybe thinking like of becoming aware of your privileged position as somebody who has access to air conditioning in your workplace, and then maybe within the workplace, you know, if you become aware of that, and if there's a really bad heat wave, is there some areas of the workplace that can be opened as respite for other people, for example? Because I mean, it can be really, really tough on some people's health. Like, and if you, yeah. So maybe something like that, and maybe through that it could also be conceptualized, kind of becoming aware of that position that you have, and what you could then do together. Does the sound okay? Yeah, cool. And then yeah, so then this fossil fuel companies thing. What is the calculus for responsibility? How can individuals in general rank who kind of all these collective agents they should address? And then in general, and then you gave this really good example of all the good things you've been doing in the university already. All the great things you've managed to do as a collective agent. So it's all this kind of stuff that I'm saying in the book people should do, right? You've done it. And then you were putting this kind of very, well, you know, this is kind of nothing on the broader impact on Australian emissions, right? So I have kind of two responses for that. I don't think it's nothing, because I mean there's already this debate on if individual emissions are actually harmful, and some people, like you mentioned John Broom, like he's actually calculated and has this argument like why even individuals' emissions, like average Westerners, are actually can be harmful, not necessarily, but quite likely, you know. So then when we multiply it by like a university, I think it would be hard to argue that it doesn't have any impact, because the thing with climate change is not like there's a certain amount of harm that's definitely going to happen. I mean, the more emissions, the more harm there will be. So maybe there is some, you know, some good that you've done already just as a collective, even in terms of if we're just looking at the kind of just purely the direct consequences. But I think in this case, we shouldn't look at just the direct consequences. It's more like then these collective agents are also shifting the norms of what should collective agents do. So by taking all that action, and you can see this in the diet, you know, like when you're like getting like universities in the States where like getting their funds away from investments away from fossil fuel companies, right? Others start following suit, and then when they've done something, then some other like field starts doing it. So all these things, because we are social creatures, and because of the whole kind of interlinkage between like within collective responsibility, there. I don't think we can like really be certain when it's impactful or not. And then also in the end of the day, it's like it's almost the best you can do, unless you're in the super powerful position, like, or you're super rich, or you're like, I don't know, a senator in the United States or something like that, or an Australian prime minister, you know. Maybe this really is all that can be expected of you, because I'm not saying that individuals should go and fix climate change. That's just going to happen. Like, we need to fix it together. Enough people need to care to fix it together. So maybe in a sense you could say that you have done all you can do as employees of your university, right? And it has some impact, maybe it's enough, and others should do something as well. I would say something along those lines, maybe, rather than, but it doesn't mean that then, you know, that then you can just rest on your laurels, you know. But I do think it's almost impossible to get any kind of formula then what exactly any one person or even one collective agent should exactly do. And I go into the complications, you know, in the book, but why it's almost impossible to say anything like that. But I don't know if that satisfies your question.
I think I mean, spending years working on a new sustainability strategy at the same time that emissions are going up, that more gas is being drilled, more gas is being exported. I guess it gets to the sabotage question. Would we have been better off doing sabotage, right, of the fossil fuel industry instead of trying to get the university to change its food policy, right? And where does that responsibility lie, and how do we make those choices about responsibility within different kinds of collectives? Because we are citizens, We are responsible for what the state is doing in terms of expanding fossil fuel extraction. So how do we make that decision? What's the calculus? Do we just work in that collective that's closer to us, where we think we can make some change, even if it's not addressing the larger question? It's just really been that sort of dilemma, is, what's the calculus there? We don't have time to do everything. We don't have time to address all of the responsibilities that we have. And so how do we make that decision about where to put our time?
Question. I don't think I have an answer to that again. I think it's like, I think I say somewhere in the book that that partly that answer depends on your personal qualities as well. So it depends on like the kind of roles you have. Maybe if you have an easy, like a clear role that you should do something in a collective agent, maybe then whatever is the closest is where you should take it. But maybe you're like really, really good at getting other people like excited and on board. Maybe then you should be an activist. But if you're like super shy and that gives you sleepless nights, then maybe you should do something else. The point is just like do something. Rather than thinking, so the whole idea is like against this idea like you're an individual, you are nothing that you do matters. So the thinking is just like you don't know that, do something. and then and I think it's almost impossible to also calculate that would it be better to do some activism. Probably both are needed, but also if you go very far under the extreme measures in activism, that can also have this kind of pushback effects then, which I think is very unlikely that you're going to have any you have very much less negative pushback on the kind of things that you've been doing at the university, right? So then it's more like easier to estimate the kind of good benefits you get from it than if you go and stick your hand to Mona Lisa with a glue,
No, well, I'd like to encourage people to do good things rather than anything. So because we do see that markets deliver, even though we are very small and individually don't have any impact. Nevertheless, we see many good things that are. We don't use so much child labor any longer, or many other sort of. Economists are starting to think that if you individually care about the common good, at least to some extent, then that tends to lead to outcomes where even small people have an impact. When you scale up the number of people who care, and then it will have a noticeable impact. Not necessarily the full solution, but it's really about scaling up the number of people who care, and that's very much about what you say in the book that you should educate people. I mean, not educate, but you should have the process of for example, this deliberation that can help in this respect.
There's a positive feedback loop, right? There's a sense of efficacy if you participate in something that actually accomplishes something. And then there's a sense, well, I can do something, right? I can take responsibility, I can do more. So there is a reason to do that kind of action.
A lot of people are very aware of also the kind of political power that people can have. So it seems to be only the people who've gotten already that experience that you can actually affect things, and then you can feel maybe I can affect other things as well.
Yeah. So maybe we should just have questions from the audience.
Thank you very much. It has been very, very interesting, and I have loved this discussion so far. Having not read the book, so I don't know if this is answered but following the discussion and continuing directly where you ended actually here about gluing your hand to the Mona Lisa or these kind of extreme actions, I was wondering, because it's one of the things, once you're doing such a thing, there's always, of course, also certain kind of responsibility to you taking those extreme means in use, how much you should know or anticipate how effective that kind of action is. So And actually, we, with my colleague Ninni, we had a kind of a paper about how much those activists, they do have not moral responsibility, epistemic responsibility for taking being aware about the effectiveness and certain kind of a risks related to that. I'm not sure if you are you talking in that book about that type of rather not moral but taking epistemic responsibility for those. And then I do have a second related to this, if I may. I was kind of listening to the discussion now here and your responses in a different way, but I didn't find in your title over there that there has been very much discussion in climate ethics about the distribution of responsibilities as a part of the climate justice. And then there are different kind of principles of distributing. I mean, based on the culpability or blameworthiness, or then more like a backward looking, and then on the other hand to the capacities. And you were kind of, you're saying both of them, they are used in some way. So I was kind of wishing perhaps you could elaborate a bit more how they are related in your kind of a mindset over there. They are super polluters, but then on the other hand, when we are talking about the collective capacities, then it's a bit trickier. Yeah, how much do you have? It's pretty much related to what you are saying, that how much we do have the responsibility for those capacities when we are talking about our shared role in the collective.
Yeah, thank you. So I on the to take your last question first. So I do talk about that sometimes maybe the responsibility of super polluters comes closer to the shared social orientation kind of thing, of maybe coming together as like as super rich investors, or like looking at the social norms. That's the example I'm using in the book. So maybe it's something, it's kind of like a supercharged version of the kind of argument I give in chapter 4 about that we should look at our social norms, and those have the kind of knock-on effects on emissions in general. And then when like because that's that group where the emissions are really growing at insane speed. So when you're coming up with new things like space travel, and then you're putting it in your Instagram, I went to space. Well, I need to go to space as well because the Joneses are doing that, you know. So this is like the kind of, that's really dangerous on the kind of super rich 0.3% range, right? When we're coming up with these new mega polluting consumption, and just ignoring that we're in this climate crisis and thinking that's cool. I mean, it's cool, but you really shouldn't do it, right? So often I think they're kind of the responsibility comes into, and then because lots of these rich people, they're not necessarily famous people, you know, but of course they can have a lot of impact in their own social groups and stuff. And then of course if you're rich and famous, then that's something you should maybe really question, what kind of messages you're sending out. But a lot of it comes to investment choices. And there is a lot of work on this. A lot of really rich people want to invest also ethically and climate friendly, right? So there is a lot of this movement to that as well. And then it's also like about things like offering financial products for super rich people that are more climate friendly, for example. So it comes to those kinds of things as well. So it's kind of, it's the same arguments as to the individual or normal, but it kind of supercharged because the emissions are massive. Like they're, I have the percentages here, but like they're really much bigger than the average individuals. In terms of the, I don't talk about, I think it's a very good and interesting question. I don't talk about the epistemic responsibility of knowing of your actions. Also part of it, it's not like a consequentialist based argument in general. And so, but I do think there is like, what I am talking about there is like the need to just be aware of how your actions can have these, yeah, kind of knock-on effects kind of in the social norms and stuff, kind of just, and that's the whole shared social orientation of kind of becoming like, well, maybe a bit uneasy, and often it's not about really, you know, you said like that, you know, there's different, there's lots of different bases for responsibility. So I say in the beginning of the book, I'm not really interested in this kind of blame kind of responsibility here. I'm not saying it's not important. It's very important, especially when we're looking at the fossil fuel companies and stuff, but I'm focusing here on forward. So more like capacity, but also the kind of impact. It's without blame, but the shared social orientation stuff is like to bring your focus on what are the impacts that your actions are having, kind of become aware of yourself in the social structures and what those other people in your reference group are doing. And then maybe challenging those ways of doing things. So there's like so it's not like fully on capacity. It's also like you as a group are having these causal effects. But then because it's collective responsibility, it doesn't mean like, now feel really bad about it, you know, or individually fix it. So I'm not giving those kinds of arguments there. So it's a very kind of, and I am alluding to some of those theories, but what I'm trying to do here is concentrate on the aspects of climate change responsibility that's not really discussed in the literature much. So I'm giving reference to some of those theories, but I'm not going into the details here. So I've put a lot of effort into putting a lot of practical examples there. For example, try to make it as, so there is like collective responsibility, the philosophy kind of the apparatus they're working at the background, but I'm also trying to make it accessible by giving real life examples in everything I say. So that's like the kind of focus. So I'm not really focusing on the kind of, it's not supposed to be an overview of all the important debates in the climate ethics, if that makes sense. But yeah, so it's a forward looking focus on it mostly, except when it comes to fossil fuel companies there, I'm doing a lot of backward stuff. Yeah. Yeah, there's blame there.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks, Sarah, and the panelists. Yeah, I haven't read the book either, so it's just mostly an impression that comes across what you just said and some other things that I've heard you say. So I'm not sure whether it's the presentation, but I'm kind of worried that you might give at least the impression that you're going to give a bit too easy absolution to our individual sins, in the sense that it's. I mean, I like it. I feel better now, but I'm not sure whether it's right. whether it's the right thing. So I was kind of worried that it's so easy to show the completely correct numbers that okay, it's these fossil fuel companies that are responsible for basically like this and this amount of the emissions, and then kind of just don't talk about the fact that they are not kind of polluting just for the hell of it. So some evil Bond villain is not giving them the money to pollute. So it's because what we do that they get the money, and just mention the British context and the political power of the energy companies. But then again, last winter, double-digit number of British households had to make the decision whether to warm their houses or feed their families. So I'm not sure whether it's a question, but it's more like a comment. So it's kind of and yeah, you put the yacht there, and of course because we were kind of envious and stuff. So I would really like to blow that up. I would feel really good. But yeah, so yeah, I'm kind of a bit too worried whether you're making it a bit too easy for us.
Thanks. So I'm not. So did you want to say something or no?
I would like to say,
Yeah.
if it's okay. That resonates very well how I think about as well about the pictures about the yacht and so. If you think about, in the society we share this, that we have aversion to extreme inequality. So that seems to be like a shared value. Well, I think it's at least in this country. We think that, you know, there's a reason to, for example, for the existence of the welfare state to sort of to take into account that people have different backgrounds and abilities, and you know, something that they cannot control. If you think about climate change or these big externalities like climate change, the traditional sort of approach has been that we don't have to care about the inequality because, you know, it's efficient to make sure that you're responsible for the externalities you're causing on others. You pay for the harm, and that has nothing to do with inequality. But when it comes to climate change, then I think it has fundamentally to do with this sort of primitive reasons we want to have concern for inequality, because we have given people in the recent decades a reason to believe that they can live this way of having cars and you know, live in houses in the way we live nowadays, and then the society shifts course to fight climate change, and that means that not all the people have the option to easily change the way of life. They are stuck with the commuting patterns and with their work and their cars, and if you try to put in place policies that the rich people can comply with easily, there's a significant portion of the society that cannot easily comply, and this is an important friction that we are facing here, and it kind of justifies why we need to accompany the policies that we put in place with transfers and sort of all those things that we have in the welfare state. It has to do with values, but it's also a practical challenge when we implement these policies. And somehow, you know, you showed the numbers about the rich people polluting, or the wealthier people, but it is the case that if you look at certain sectors of the economy, it is really the poor people who are polluting, and they have difficulties in changing the way they are living, and this is not always showing up in the aggregate numbers, but this kind of relates to, it's not, kind of resonates with the comment.
Thank you. In a way, it's kind of distracting, maybe having a yacht there and stuff. That's just like it's just one chapter, and the idea is just more like inequality. I don't think is discussed enough in climate ethics debate. I just think it's like it's a real problem that's also affecting our chances of getting emissions reduction, because it's just gotten so kind of out of hand in a global scale, and these super polluters can be found all around the world. So it's more like I just wanted to highlight that as well. But you're absolutely right that there's lots of people who cannot afford to like live greener lifestyles. And this is kind of the same kind of argument that is made in a lot of like social justice literature, for example. Not everybody can afford to eat healthily, for example. You know, it's much more expensive, you know, to buy like green vegetables than it is to get the frozen ready meal in a lot of places. So it's very easy, like when you can afford to do this thing, like put the solar panels on your roof, to go like, I'm saintly, and it doesn't mean that you are. You just have some options, and then you should definitely take them. But that's why I have that thing about the whole infrastructure and stuff, that we shouldn't ever like remove the individual from the collective, because it just doesn't make sense. So that's why it's always shared responsibility. And then I'm giving kind of all the reasons. And this is maybe where we're getting then to the things that Jaakko are worried about, that that you know, like I'm letting off the individual then too easily. That so I'm not trying to make you feel better. I've failed if you feel better now. I think you should feel very responsible and feel like you should do something, but together with others. That's the idea. That I don't want you to be alone in your room thinking, oh, I failed. But like feeling together, like, yeah, we kind of failed. We are failing collectively badly. And that can be in smaller groups as well. So for example, one thing I don't have a perfect solution at all is like the amount of flying that academics do, for example. I can really see why it's important, and it is very important. These kind of live events, it is totally different having these kind of debates than always at Zoom, but then also that's not a good social norm either that we're having, you know, like, well, what is the good balance there, for example? So I think we should be feeling uncomfortable about a lot of our lifestyles, and also to do with the things that you're saying, like once people have gotten used to certain thing, you know, it's very hard to pull people back from that. Like once you and then it's also the infrastructure. If the whole area is built in the way that you have these big suburbs where was just feeding in through like the highway to get into the city, and that's where the jobs are, you know, you have to change a lot to make that working as a kind of green community. So that's why it is like you cannot escape that it's a collective problem. So that's why I'm just trying to do that. It's always like individuals as members is shared responsibility. Individuals as constituents is shared responsibility. So the kind of like the super rich, they're kind of like, it's just in that rare thing that they have this direct responsibility for their emissions as well. Most of us have shared, so we should like feel bad together or something like that.
Can I respond to that question? Just on the very first part of the question about reading the book and feeling let off the hook. So my sense was exactly the opposite, right? I'm reading this book and I'm just gathering a list of responsibilities, right, in different collectives. So even though there's this really good stuff about the structural causes of climate change, there's still this insistence on pointing out the variety of places in which we are or can feel as though we're responsible. So there's a lot. This is why I asked the question. You know, okay, we have all these responsibilities. How do we, you know, how do we rank them? But the other thing, so that's the one response. But on inequity and impacts, and I mean, there's so many of these questions that come down to, and sorry, it's the political scientist in me, bad intentional policy choices, right? People are dying in the UK in the winter because of bad policy. People are dying in Sydney in the summer during heat waves because of bad policy. It's housing policy and a variety of things, right? There are choices there, and there are impacts that we can have, right? In Sydney, I don't own a car. I haven't owned a car in 13 years. I don't need to own a car in Sydney. Just like here, right? There's good public transit in the city, but I can't leave the city because there's no decent rail, right? But in other places, there's no way. You have to. And so as a poor person, right, you have to have a car, and you do have those additional emissions. But that's policy, right? So this is part of the question that I was asking, right? So we can have an effect in this collective. We can change what the University of Helsinki or the University of Sydney do. But what about this effect on public policy, which does create these inequities and create all these extra, right? What's our responsibility in changing those?
I think we are feeling responsible enough for today. I would like to thank our speakers very much for coming. Thanks for writing the book. This was a great discussion, I think. So thanks very much. And thanks everyone for being here. Also to our online audience. I don't know how many there are, but thank you and bye-bye.